good to see you. Congratulations.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Really, big day. Before we get to the specifics of each of your roles, how do you see yourself working together? It seems to me that Commerce and Treasury, key roles in terms of economic growth. How do you see yourself working together?
Same way we did during the campaign. We were very much a team during the campaign, and we've known each other for quite a few years, so this is nothing new. Working together is going to be one of the hallmarks of this administration.
Absolutely. We're going to have an integrated plan and work closely between Commerce and Treasury to make sure that we drive growth in this country. Our #1 priority is sustained 3 to 4% GDP.
3 to 4% GDP is almost double what we're seeing right now. And of course, how do you get there is the question in terms of growth. When would you expect 3 to 4 economic growth?
You know, I think this is something over the next couple of years we're going to get to, and I think it's very achievable. I mean, this has been an administration for the last 8 years where we haven't had enough growth. Our #1 priority is going to be tax reform. We think that by lowering the corporate tax rate, we're going to make U.S. corporations incredibly competitive and create enormous amounts of money that comes back onshore and creates jobs.
Let's talk about how you do that, Stephen, because obviously you followed Trump throughout the entire campaign process. In terms of your first steps during this transition period and first steps in January, how do you get that tax reform moving?
Well, the good thing about this is Wilbur and I have worked together on the economic plan with the president-elect throughout the campaign. We were integral to both economic speeches, the one in Detroit as well as the one in New York. And we have a plan. We've been working with the policy group. We're already sitting down and discussing this with Congress. And this is going to be something that happens absolutely within the first 90 days of this presidency. We're going to have a major tax reform, biggest tax reform since Reagan. And it's not just going to be a cut in corporate taxes, but it's also going to be a very large middle-income tax cut that's going to help this country.
That's what I want to ask you about. I'm going to save that for in a moment. I want to ask you about this idea that corporate taxes go to 15%. What happens to individual taxes? Because there was some debate that maybe he would deal with individual taxes later, so we'll get to that. But Wilbur, let me ask you about steel tariffs that you've dealt with in your private life in running your business, and the idea that people are worried about potential tariffs actually being a disruptor for economic growth. How do you see tariffs and trade changing?
Well, trade is the important thing to change, and tariffs are one potential ultimate tool. But really, they're, for the most part, a negotiating tool to get the countries to relieve the tariff and non-tariff barriers to our trade. The real objective is to build our exports, not so much to kill the imports. That's a total mischaracterization of what's being done. Now, if need be, there will be tariffs, and there'll be especially tariffs for punitive purposes for people who dump.
Characterize that for us, because I don't know that most people understand Chinese dumping, for example, and the idea that American companies have to compete with products coming from China that are much cheaper.
Yes, and they're cheaper partly because they're being sold at a loss. 1/3 of all the state-owned enterprises in China have never made a profit. 1/3.
Wow.
And that's a huge slug, about half of their entire economy. Because China is really about jobs. It's not so much about corporate profit. That's one thing that people don't really quite get. And for example, steel, as you know, an industry I know quite a little bit about.
Exactly.
They have 1 billion tons of steel capacity. They need about 700 million themselves. They've been selling overseas about 100 million tons, mostly at very aggressively low prices, and they still have 200 million tons idle. That's a horrible combination. That needs to get fixed.
So how do you fix it?
They're already starting to fix it. For the first time, I was just over there a few weeks ago, then for the first time there's a real program for the federal government, the localities, to get together with new investors to take care of the people who will be dislocated by consolidation within their industry.
Okay. And Wilbur, Commerce Secretary obviously is a liaison between companies and the White House. You'll be on the front lines dealing with companies all over the world.
Well, I've spent my life doing that.
Yes, you have. So what are you hearing from companies today in terms of what they'd like to see?
Well, judging from the emails so far, they're as enthused as can be about Stephen and myself.
Yeah.
They know us. They've dealt with us before. They have a pretty good idea what they can expect, and they can't wait.
Stephen, if it's one thing that you hear from managers of businesses and CEOs over and over again, it's the fact that our tax plan is the most unfavorable in the industrialized world, the highest taxes in the industrialized world. Talk to us. You said in the first 90 days you're going to have tax reform. Walk us through it.
Sure. So this is going to be a major priority, and there's two aspects of it. One, as I mentioned, is corporate taxes, and the other is personal income taxes. And we're going to simplify the personal income tax, lower from 7 brackets down to 3, simplify it, deliver a very significant middle income tax cut that's going to be combined with the child care program. And the other aspect of it is on the upper end, we'll cut the tax rate, but it will be offset with a significant reduction of deductions. So for the upper class, it won't be a tax cut, but it will be a simplification. It will lower the marginal rate, which will spur investment.
You say it will spur investment because you have to assume that with a better situation on earnings, because companies are paying less in tax, they will reinvest that money in their business and hire.
Absolutely. We fundamentally believe in dynamic scoring of taxes, and this is something we're going to be working with Congress and passing legislation.
It's a similar plan to what we heard out of the House, Paul Ryan's plan. Do you think they will go for 15%, or do you think maybe it will be a little higher than that once all gets said and done and it passes through Congress?
Well, we're committed. We think 15% is the right tax rate. It has a lot of similarities to the House GOP plan. There are certain aspects that are different, so the Trump tax plan is slightly different. And, we'll work with Congress to get this done. We couldn't be more excited about it being a major priority and a major part of creating growth in this country.
Look, you've been a business guy for a long time, and we've talked about this for a long time. Why has it been so difficult to get tax reform through already?
Well, I'd say there's two aspects. There's tax reform and there's regulatory reform, and those are the two things that we hear. But I think as it relates to taxes, I think people understand we have to simplify the system and make the United States competitive, and that's going to be our priority.
Well, I guess people didn't want to do it, right? I mean, you heard Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail calling it trumped up, trickle down economics. So how do you push back on that Hillary said, look, just because you're making a favorable environment for business doesn't ensure that they're going to invest in their businesses and hire new workers? What's the pushback?
Well, let me first say, Clinton had very different policies than Trump, and I think we see where the country is. Okay. The second thing is, we have an administration that's going to listen. So sometimes we'll agree with business and sometimes we won't, but we're absolutely committed to listen. And if you look at this, we have a president and a vice president-elect who picked up the phone and called the CEO of United Technologies and said, we want you to keep jobs in this country. And our priority is going to be creating good jobs for the American worker. For the last 15 years, the American worker has gone nowhere. And this administration is about putting them back to work and creating good jobs.
I think you make a great point.